All right, so let's look at the expenditure approach in a little bit more detail. So if we're going to use the expenditure approach, it basically involves four different components. The first component is expenditures on consumption. So this is the biggest part of GDP. It's what you and I engage in almost every single day, just buying things to consume, right? So that's consumption. And then we can further break down consumption into three subcategories. The first is durable consumer goods, and durable just meaning they last a long time. So things that last generally more than 3 years. So things like cars, furniture, appliances. These are all durable consumer goods. And that's opposed to non-durable goods, which are things that are used up in less than 3 years. So things like food, gasoline, I think clothing is a non-durable, if I'm not mistaken. It's like right on the cusp, right? Some clothing can last more than 3 years, some can't. But in any case, hopefully you get the idea there. And then the last one is services, which aren't physical goods, but they are intangible goods, right? Mental or physical help. So tax services, haircuts, right? Education. Right now, I am providing an education service to you. So things that aren't tangible, that we can't touch them, but they're intangible goods, right? So these are the three different subcategories of consumption expenditures. The next category of expenditure in GDP is called gross private domestic investment, or just investment for short. And this is basically the creation of capital goods. And if you forgot what capital goods are, these are things like factories and machinery. So investment is the creation of these things that can yield production and hence consumption in the future. So recall back to our PPC, right? Our production possibilities curve, and the trade-off between investment and consumption, right? So think about that as you think about this new concept here. So it's the creation of these capital goods. It also includes changes in businesses' inventories. Okay, so when a car sales, when a car dealership increases the number of cars it has on its lot, that's an investment, right? It's increased its inventory of vehicles. When it reduces the number of cars it has on its lot, that's actually called disinvestment, or reduction in investment. So negative investment. And so that's what we mean by changes in business inventory. Investment also includes repairs made to machinery and buildings. So any upkeep expenditures on repairing factories and machines and buildings is also part of gross private domestic investment. Now, investment itself has some subcategories. So there are producer durables or capital goods, and similarly to consumer durables, these are things that have a lifespan of more than 3 years. Another subcategory is fixed investment, and this is purchases by businesses of newly produced durables or capital goods. So that's what fixed investment is called. And then when there's a change in inventory, that's called inventory investment. So changes in stocks of inventory. And it doesn't have to be final goods and services alone. It could also be inventories of raw materials as well. All right, before we look at the other two categories of the expenditure approach, let's quickly look at a policy example. So thinking about accuracy versus precision in measuring business fixed investment. So to make the measure of business fixed investment more accurate, The Bureau of Economic Analysis has added forms of intangible investments, such as spending on research and development. And the inclusion of this boosts GDP levels in every year. And GDP has risen about 3% in recent years. So when the Bureau of Economic Analysis revised GDP levels back to the 1960s, however, estimates for prior years became less precise than before. So that's an interesting aspect there. Okay, moving on to the next category of the expenditure approach is government expenditures, right? So anything that the government spends money on, and this includes all levels of government, state, local, and federal. And it's simply valued, its expenditures valued at cost, right? So whatever the government spends, that's what the value of the production for the government is valued at, is calculated as. So this one's pretty straightforward. There are some subcategories, but we'll talk about different parts of government expenditure in another chapter. And the last category is something called net exports. So this has to do with international trade. And the interesting thing about net exports is it is actually calculated using a difference. So net exports is another way to think about it is it's foreign expenditure. So what do foreign countries spend on production here inside of the United States borders? And we can calculate net exports as the difference between total exports and total imports. So we simply calculate it as total exports minus total imports. And we will abbreviate it with the variable X for exports, net exports. All right, so now that we've seen all four categories of the expenditure approach, we can present our expenditure approach for calculating GDP, and it's pretty straightforward. Using the expenditure approach, GDP is just equal to consumption expenditure plus investment expenditure plus government expenditure plus net exports, right? Which again is exports minus imports, or foreign expenditure, right? So that's the expenditure approach. Now, what if a nation's measure of aggregate economic activity were based on production using inputs that its residents own and operate in other countries? So I mentioned this earlier, right? This is what's called gross national product. So this is calculating production using, looking at, instead of the production that takes place within a country's borders, it looks at the production that takes place by the residents of the country, right? And so a resident of the United States might own resources that are in China, right? And so the production of goods and services using those resources that are in China would not be part of GDP, right? Because it happens inside, it wouldn't be part of US GDP. It'd be part of China's GDP because it takes place inside China's borders. But it would be part of the US GNP, gross national product, if the resources are owned by someone that lives inside the United States. So that's the difference between GNP and GDP. GNP excludes the portion of GDP that's produced by factors within the nation that is owned by people residing in other countries, right? So that's the other thing too, is like if, let's say that, so Toyota, right, has factories in the United States that make cars. Those cars that are made in the US by Toyota are part of GDP. But they are not part of our GNP because those resources are owned by residents of Japan. And so hopefully you're getting an idea there of the difference between GNP and GDP. Now, for the US, not huge differences between GNP and GDP. But for smaller nations, that is particularly those that have a lot of factors of production owned by people abroad, GNP and GDP can be significantly different from each other for these small countries. So, but again, the one that economists focus on is GDP. All right, so let's look at a chart here of GDP and its different components. Okay, so GDP is the blue line, and so that's total GDP, and we've got GDP going all the way back to 1930. So you can see it's been growing nice and steadily over the years. There was a slight dip right around the Great Depression, and also a slight dip during the last recession, the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. Just below that blue line is an orange line, and that's the consumption part. And so, like I said, consumption is the biggest component of GDP. Then the green line there is government purchases. Okay, so that's the government portion. And then the purple line is the investment and net exports portion to get put together. And as you can see, investment and net exports are almost the same as government purchases. So that's pretty interesting. Something else I'll note here is that the GDP is in a ratio scale. So that's why it's not evenly spaced between hash marks. So that's kind of like a logarithmic scale if you're familiar with that, but don't worry about that. All right. There's something else we need to know about called net domestic product. And this is basically a measure of GDP that allows for depreciation, right? It accounts for depreciation. So it's the amount that businesses would have to save in order to take care of depreciating machines and other equipment, okay? So to figure that out, to get net domestic product, we simply take GDP and we subtract depreciation. So again, depreciation is what businesses have to save in order to maintain their machinery, in order to repair their machinery. Okay, so that's what depreciation is. So again, let me go into this a little bit more. So machines and buildings, things that businesses use to produce goods and services, deteriorate over time, right, through use. And that's what depreciation is. And we can measure it as dollar value by basically looking at what it would cost to repair it to its original new state, right? So that's what depreciation is. So if we subtract that from GDP, we get NDP. And we might be interested in looking at this because maybe we want to ignore production that is dedicated to repairing worn out buildings and machinery. Maybe we want to ignore that. So what we're really interested in is net domestic product. All right, so looking at this more closely, if we do some substitution, so we know that net domestic product is gross domestic product minus depreciation. And we also have our expenditure equation for GDP. It's equal to consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus net exports. And so we can rewrite net domestic product as C plus I plus G plus X minus depreciation. Okay, so that's okay, great. We need to take it one step further for this to be useful. So basically, what we're getting is that if we take depreciation away from investment, we get something called net investment, because depreciation really is expenditures on improving worn out buildings and machinery is part of investment, right? So we may want to subtract that from gross investment. And when we do, we get something called net investment. So we have a new equation for net domestic product. It's equal to consumption plus net investment plus government expenditure plus net exports, right? Again, where net investment is gross investment or just investment minus depreciation. And again, this is so that we can, if we want to, we can ignore production that was dedicated to replacing worn out buildings and machinery.